Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video of Criminal Cases Today. Today, we're going to delve into the dark story of Yuan Tan and his mother Lian Jiegua, the young man who planned to kill his own mother to free himself from her control and even tried to end his father's life. A case that shook Canada and left everyone wondering, how far can ambition and desperation go? Stay until the end to understand all the details of this macabre plot. Let's go. On June 8, 2012, the Vancouver Police Department in Canada received a distressing call from a young Chinese student named Yan, 25 years old. Yan was desperate. His mother, Li, who had come from China to visit him, had mysteriously disappeared just a day before they were due to return home. Li, a 47-year-old woman, was a simple person who spoke only Chinese and had great difficulty communicating in English, which made her even more vulnerable in a foreign country. Li and her husband Tang's trip had been carefully planned. They wanted to see their son, who had been studying in Canada for the past 5 years. Yan had moved to Vancouver to continue his studies and had already adapted to city life, a place that combines the natural beauty of snow-capped mountains, sparkling ocean, and lush forests. It was Li's first time visiting Vancouver, and she was excited to see the world her son lived in firsthand. Tang had been to the city before for work, but this trip was special because it would be a family trip. On June 7, the trio was preparing to return to China. Their flight was scheduled for that afternoon, and they were starting to get anxious about returning home. That morning, Yan went to the B&B where his parents were staying to drive them to the airport. When he got there, he found his father still fast asleep. He decided to let him rest a little longer, since they had plenty of time before their flight. He suggested that he and his mother go have breakfast together. Li, with a smile on his face, agreed. She put on her coat, and together they went out for what would be their last meal in Vancouver. They went to a local restaurant, one of those simple but cozy ones. Yan knew that his mother liked lighter dishes, so he ordered something that she could enjoy, something that reminded her of the flavors of China, but with a local touch. During breakfast, they talked about how beautiful Vancouver was, how much they missed home, and their plans for the future. Li was relaxed, happy to have spent those days with her son. After eating, they went back to the B&B. Yan started packing his bags in the car, getting everything ready for the trip. As he went back and forth with the bags, he could see his mother watching him through the bedroom window. He greeted her with a smile whenever they met eyes. To him, everything seemed normal. Suddenly, Yan realized that he needed to buy something last minute. It was a quick trip to the nearby mall, a matter of a few minutes. Before leaving, he told his mother that he would be back soon and went alone. When he returned, a surprise awaited him. Li was no longer at the window. Thinking she might be inside the house, he went inside and called out to her, but there was no answer. The silence began to bother him. The feeling that something was wrong took hold of Yan. Where could she have gone? He ran to the bedroom and woke up his father, Tang. He quickly asked if he knew where his mother was. Tang, still half asleep, said no. At first, they tried to remain calm. Maybe she had gone for a quick walk. Maybe she was just somewhere nearby. Time passed, and their concern grew. They tried to call her, but the phone wouldn't answer. Nervousness began to take over. After a few hours without a sign of Li, Yan and Tang decided to search the city. They drove around Vancouver, checking every corner, every street near the B&B. Nothing. It was as if Li had disappeared into thin air. They went to the nearby park and asked people on the street, but no one had seen a woman with Li's features. Their flight to China was approaching. Yan, still hoping that her mother had gotten confused and gone to the airport alone, convinced her father to go there. They raced against the clock, arriving at the airport just before boarding time. With their hearts racing, they looked around, hoping to see her among the passengers. But Li was not there. When the airport announced the flight was boarding, Tang was between staying and continuing to search for his wife or returning home to China. Yan, trying to calm his father, assured him that he would stay in Vancouver and search for his mother until he found her. Tang, although hesitant, decided to board. The flight to China was long and agonizing. The seat next to him, which was supposed to be occupied by his wife, remained empty throughout the journey, a heavy silence in the air. The day after his mother Li disappeared, Yan woke up to an even greater emptiness. The silence that hung over the B&B where they were staying was unbearable. He had already spent hours searching for her, without success, and panic was beginning to take over his thoughts from her. Not knowing what else to do, he finally decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, Yan, with eyes full of concern, explained everything that had happened the day before, every detail, hoping that they could make some sense of this mystery. The police conducted a thorough inspection of the scene, but to Yan's relief and frustration, they found nothing suspicious. No signs of a struggle, no clues as to where Lee might be. However, the officers began to entertain hypotheses. One of them was that Lee had decided to stay in Canada illegally, not wanting to return to China. To the police, this seemed like a possible explanation, since there was no clear evidence of foul play. But this theory soon proved to be full of flaws. Yan's family was no ordinary family. They were very wealthy and successful in China, running a thriving furniture shipping business that served clients all over the world, including the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Yan's father, Tang, traveled frequently for business, and this was not his first time in Canada. Furthermore, Lee had never shown any interest in leaving her home country. She was a simple, family-oriented woman with no history of addiction, mental health issues, or extramarital affairs. She had no known enemies, and nothing in her life indicated that she might want to stay illegally in another country. The police then abandoned this theory of escape. And that's when a new worrying detail emerged. All of Lee's belongings, money, passport and purse, were found inside Yan's car, intact. If she had really decided to run away or hide, why would she leave everything behind her? This made Yan's heart race even faster. The idea that his mother might have been kidnapped began to pound in his head. Desperate not to waste any more time, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Yan set out on a true mission to find his mother. He printed flyers with Lee's photo of her, highlighting her physical characteristics and the details of the day she disappeared. These flyers were distributed throughout Vancouver. Yan was not content to simply distribute the material. He went to the local press, participated in interviews, held press conferences, did everything he could to publicize the case and obtain any information that could help him discover his mother's whereabouts. Her pain was visible, and it touched people deeply. Her father, Tang, also returned to Vancouver. That man, always so steady and accustomed to dealing with complex business, was now devastated, completely focused on finding his wife. Yan and Tang's story will soon spread throughout the city. The Chinese community, in particular, was deeply moved by the family's plight. Many people, both locals and immigrants, volunteered to help in the search. It was common to see groups of people walking the streets of Vancouver, with flyers in their hands, asking everyone if they had seen Lee. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. But the days dragged on without any concrete results. The mystery deepened with each passing moment. There was no ransom demand, which weakened the theory that Lee could have been kidnapped. Typically, in kidnapping cases, criminals contact people asking for money in exchange for the victim's release. But here, there was no sign of that. And as time passed, the more the police began to consider other possibilities, much darker possibilities. Faced with the lack of answers, the police decided to take a closer look at Lee's own family. They began to investigate every detail, every move made by Yan and Tang. And that's when something strange caught the investigators' attention. Yan had rented an apartment in the same B&B where his parents were staying, but he never mentioned it to the police. All this time, the officers thought that Yan was in his own apartment, far from where his parents were staying. But in fact, he was right next to them. When the police asked Yan why he hadn't revealed this detail earlier, his answer was cold and direct: "You didn't ask me, so I didn't tell you." This simple answer made the officers suspicious. Why would Yan omit such basic information? Suspicion began to grow. Before we continue, just make sure you are already subscribed to the channel, because here you will always know about criminal cases that shocked the world and you don't want to miss out, so go ahead and subscribe. Thank you very much. Now back to the subject. The investigators continued to press, asking why Yan had rented a room at the B&B if he already had an apartment nearby. He justified it by saying that he wanted to spend as much time as possible with his parents, since they were there to visit him. It was an argument that made sense, but it didn't eliminate the feeling that something was out of place. The next day, with no news from his mother, Yan finally made an important decision. He called the police. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found nothing that immediately indicated what had happened. Everything seemed in order at the B&B, and there were no signs of a struggle or any other visible clues. However, the investigators began to formulate theories. One of them was that Li, Yan's mother, could be trying to stay in Canada illegally and, for this reason, had disappeared to avoid returning to China. But this idea soon proved to have many holes. Li was no ordinary person. She and her family were financially stable, with a very successful furniture shipping business. They served clients in various parts of the world, including the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia. In addition, Li had visited her son Yan in Canada several times, accompanying her husband on his business trips. She had no history of mental health problems, addictions, or enemies. Nothing in her life indicated that she had any reason to want to flee and remain illegally in another country. This theory was completely discarded when Li's personal belongings were discovered. Money, passport, purse, they were all in Yan's car. If Li had really planned to disappear, she would not have left behind such important documents. For Yan, the only logical explanation was that his mother had been kidnapped. Driven by desperation, he decided that he would not wait for the police to sort it out on their own. Yan took action. He began distributing flyers around the city with his mother's photo and all the details about her disappearance. He also gave interviews to the media, held press conferences, and appealed to the public for help. He didn't want his mother's story to be forgotten, and he hoped someone would know something that could help him find her. The Chinese community in Vancouver rallied around the story. Many volunteers joined the search, scouring the streets, parks, and forests in an attempt to locate Li. As Yan struggled to find her, the police continued to investigate the case. But despite all their efforts, there was no progress. The case seemed increasingly murky. There was no ransom demand, which weakened the kidnapping theory. And as the days passed, investigators began to consider an even more frightening possibility, that Li was already dead. With no new leads, investigators turned their attention to the family. Yan, who initially seemed desperate to find his mother, began acting suspiciously. One of the first things that raised eyebrows was the fact that Yan had rented an apartment in the same B&B where his parents were staying, but had never mentioned it to the police. The detail was discovered during the investigation, and when the police asked why he hadn't told them, Yan coldly replied, "You didn't ask, so I didn't tell." This sounded strange. Why would he hide something like this? When pressed about why he had rented a room at the B&B, since he had his own apartment nearby, Yan gave an even weirder explanation. He said he wanted to spend as much time as possible with his parents. This might have made sense, but the way he responded to the questions raised more questions. Yan's behavior became even more questionable when investigators realized that he had changed his story several times. Initially, he said that his mother had disappeared from the B&B. Later, he claimed that they had gone to have breakfast together and that she had disappeared after that. Later, he said that she had disappeared from inside his apartment. These inconsistencies were alarming, and even Yan's father, Tang, began to suspect. He confronted his son, asking why he was making up these stories. Yan's response was even stranger. He said that he was trying to protect the B&B owner, who had illegally split the rent and did not want to attract the attention of the police. Despite all these lies and excuses, Tang was more concerned with finding his wife than arguing with his son. He continued to focus his efforts on searching for Li. But as time went on, the police began to investigate further and began to suspect that something much darker was going on. The investigators questioned other tenants at the B&B, but they all said that the family seemed to be on good terms. There were no reports of fighting or strange behavior. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. With no solid leads, the police decided to expand the search. They began searching wooded areas near the BNB, hoping to find some trace of Li. But unfortunately, they found nothing. Meanwhile, Tang was facing another crisis. The family business in China was beginning to fall apart due to his prolonged absence. He had no choice but to return to China to save what was left of his company. Before leaving, he entrusted Yan with the responsibility of continuing the search for his mother. Yan promised his father that he would not rest until he found her. A little over a month after Li's disappearance, on July 20, 2012, the case was handed over to the Canadian Integrated Homicide Investigation Unit. Detectives from the unit had long suspected that Li's family was involved in her disappearance, and began focusing on Yan. They returned to the BNB to conduct a more thorough search, and this time they found something that could change the course of the investigation. In the room where Yan was staying, detectives found traces of blood on the ceiling, walls, closet, and bedside table. This discovery was shocking, as it indicated that something very serious could have happened there. The blood was sent for analysis, but surprisingly, the tests failed to determine who it belonged to. Even so, the presence of blood was not enough to arrest Yan. Investigators also wanted to search Yan's apartment, but they did not have enough evidence to obtain a search warrant, and he refused to let the officers in. On the same day, July 20, 2012, police received a call that added a disturbing new chapter to the case. A suitcase containing human remains had been found on a beach near Harwood Island, about a 6-hour drive from Vancouver. When officers arrived at the beach and found the suitcase, the scene was dark and unsettling. The suitcase, partially buried in the sand, was imbued with a sense of mystery and terror. Unzipping it, they found the body of a middle-aged Asian woman. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, and her clothing matched the description given by Yuan, the missing woman's son. Preliminary identification seemed to indicate that it was Liandi. An autopsy was quickly performed to confirm the identity and determine the cause of death. The results were shocking. Liandi had been brutally assaulted. Forensic doctors discovered that she had suffered multiple blows to the head and inner spine, causing a violent and painful death. In addition, the team found 5 steel nails with inscriptions in Chinese, which were indicative of her recent spinal surgery. These details further highlighted the horror of the situation, directly linking the injuries to Liandi's previous medical condition. The results of genetic testing officially confirmed the identity of the body as that of Liandi, a 47-year-old woman. But despite the gravity of the discovery, the investigation encountered a significant obstacle: the lack of surveillance cameras in the area where the body was found. With no images or videos, investigators were in the dark as to who might have left the suitcase on the beach. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, then in charge of the case, decided to be strategic in their actions. Rather than publicize the discovery of the body, they chose to keep it a secret and not immediately inform Yuan of what they had found. This decision was made to prevent the prime suspect, Yuan, from tampering with any evidence or fleeing. In early August 2012, the police set up an undercover operation to try to get more information from Yuan. A female police officer of Chinese origin was assigned to this role. She introduced herself to Yuan as someone who had valuable information about his mother's whereabouts. Arranging to meet at a local Starbucks, the Cantonese-speaking officer revealed to Yuan that she knew about his mother's body being found in a suitcase on the beach. However, she made a surprising offer: if Yuan paid her a certain amount of money, she could solve the problem and ensure that he would not be bothered by the police again. The officer's offer made Yuan seem nervous and anxious. Despite denying any involvement in his mother's death, he was clearly worried about the situation. The officer insisted that Yuan had 2 days to consider her proposal, or she would turn over all the information to the police. That night, Yuan, in a state of panic, contacted the undercover police officer and arranged another meeting. This time, he was introduced to 2 other men, also undercover police officers, who said that disposing of a body was not a problem for them as long as he paid the required amount. One of the officers mentioned that a member of his team was dying of cancer and could take the blame for the crime if necessary. It was at this critical moment that Yuan made a shocking proposal. He suggested that if the officers killed his father, he would inherit the family fortune and could pay the requested amount. The officers pretended to accept the proposal, but demanded more details of Yuan's plan. Unaware that he was being manipulated, Yuan began to recount the full story of his family and his relationship with his parents. He revealed that he was the only son of Tang and Liendi, a successful couple in the city of Fuzhou, China. They ran a thriving business, and Liendi, with her strong character and tight control, was instrumental in the company's success. His mother was known for her authoritarian way of managing not only Yuan's business but also his life. She had absolute control over every aspect of his life, from his career to his personal relationships. Liendi was the kind of mother who could be described as a tiger mother, always monitoring and guiding her son's life. This excessive control led to Yuan feeling suffocated and frustrated. Liendi, for example, was responsible for breaking up his relationship with a high school girl because she felt she was unsuitable. She kept a tight rein on Yuan's income and decided that he should study in Canada to expand the family business. In 2006, Yuan, just 19, was sent to Canada against his will to study hotel management at Douglas Community College. He felt isolated and oppressed, far from home and the constant pressure from his mother. Instead of focusing on his studies, Yuan began lying to his parents and spending the money he earned on partying and gambling, while his grades continued to decline. To make ends meet, Yuan worked illegally at a Chinese restaurant in Vancouver, earning just $850 a month. His family in China never knew the full extent of his activities and hardships. In 2011, Yuan returned to China during a vacation and met a girl who he promptly proposed to. Liendi, once again, disapproved of the relationship, forcing Yuan to accept a bride she felt was more suitable. All of Liendi's control and manipulation of Yuan's life eventually created a climate of resentment and despair. After graduating, Yuan felt a growing emptiness. Most of his friends had returned to China, and he was feeling lonelier than ever. He longed to return home to be with his fiancée, but his father insisted that he stay in Canada and seek new horizons. Yuan was trapped in a life he didn't want, far from his family and the culture he knew. Things got even harder when his fiancée became pregnant and later miscarried. This event was a huge blow to Yuan, pushing him to his emotional breaking point. His parents came to visit him in Canada in May 2012, and Yuan rented 2 rooms in a B&B in Richmond, one for himself and one for them. He explained that he could not accommodate them in his own apartment because he shared the space with other people, and so he needed a separate place. To provide a pleasant outing, he also rented a car and tried to show his parents around Vancouver. However, the tension between them was constantly growing. Yuan felt oppressed by his parents' expectations and control. He desperately wanted to break free from the family constraints and live his life as he wished. In a moment of frustration, he found a hammer in the B&B's toolbox and decided to put it in his backpack, thinking it might come in handy. On the morning of June 7th, Yuan realized that his father was still fast asleep. With a cruel plan in mind, he scattered some coins on the bed and called his mother, Liendi, to help him clean the room. When Liendi bent down to pick up the coins, Yuan attacked her with the hammer. The blow caught her by surprise and she began to struggle. In desperation, Yuan covered her head with a blanket and continued to beat her, ensuring that there was no chance of survival. After the murder, Yuan was overcome with fear and doubt. He considered killing his father as well to keep him from being suspected, but quickly abandoned the idea. He was afraid that if they both disappeared at the same time, the police would be able to connect the dots and discover the truth. So he decided not to go through with his plan to eliminate his father. Yuan had convinced his father to return to China, claiming that he had personal matters to attend to. As soon as his father left, Yuan returned to the B&B to clean up the evidence of the crime. He worked hard to remove any traces of blood and other signs of his violent actions. With everything in order, Yuan assumed the role of a concerned son and reported his mother's disappearance to the police. He told his story to the undercover officers, unaware that he was being recorded. The recording captured every detail, revealing his suspicious behavior and the inconsistencies in his statements. If you've made it this far, please like the video, as this is very important for YouTube to continue sharing content like this with you. If you've already liked the video, thank you very much, and let's get back to the subject. Investigators, as they reviewed the evidence, began to build a solid case against Yuan. They found traces of blood in the rental car and blood and burn marks in the storage room of Yuan's apartment. These discoveries were crucial in establishing his guilt. Finally, on September 7, 2012, Yuan was arrested for the murder of his mother, exactly 3 months after her disappearance. He also faced additional charges of conspiracy to murder his father. Despite his attempts to deny the charges, Yuan could not escape the truth. When all the evidence was presented, including the video recordings, he eventually confessed. For his father, Tang, the news of Yuan's arrest came as a devastating shock. He could not believe that his own son could commit such a horrific act. Yuan, for his part, showed no remorse. He revealed that he had planned the murder for a long time and expected that if he did it in Canada, where there is no death penalty, the police would not be efficient enough to solve the crime. Ultimately, Yuan Tang overestimated his own intelligence and underestimated the effectiveness of the Canadian justice system. Despite the horrific acts he had committed, his father, Tang Jui, surprisingly continued to support him throughout the trial. Tang not only forgave his son, but also invested a large portion of his fortune to secure a quality legal defense for Yuan. His reasoning was that after the loss of his wife, he could not bear the thought of losing his only son as well. Tang, in his deep grief and despair, did everything he could to help Yuan, believing that his wife, even on the other side, would understand his intentions. During the trial, Tang tried to show that, despite all his faults, Yuan was a good man who had been corrupted by an overly strict upbringing. He pleaded for leniency, arguing that the severity of his upbringing was what had driven his son to commit such a crime. Tang saw himself as a father who still believed in his son's goodness and was desperate to save what little was left of his family. In court, Tang made a point of demonstrating his compassion and willingness to forgive, even in the midst of tragedy. He portrayed himself as a heartbroken father, believing that his wife, who had already passed away, would understand and accept his decision to continue supporting his son. Tang did so in the hope that it would somehow mitigate the situation and ease the burden of Yuan's crime. However, the court had a different view. After a lengthy and emotional trial, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled on February 2, 2015, that Yuan Tang should spend the rest of his life in prison. He was convicted of second-degree murder of his mother and attempted murder of his father. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 17 years. This case is one of the most complex and disturbing in recent Canadian history. Not only because of the gravity of the crimes committed, but also because of the nuances of control and betrayal that surround the story. In the end, Yuan faced justice, but the cost was devastating, a family completely destroyed. This was the tragic case of Lianjiegua, a story that makes us reflect on the limits of family relationships and the extreme acts that can arise in moments of tension. Now we want to know your opinion. What did you think of this case? Do you think justice was served? Leave your comment below, we really want to know your opinion on this story. And if you liked this content, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next videos. See you in the next case.